Right, so now it's my turn. Thank you for inviting me to share the results of the paper that I did jointly with Mette Ejernes. The paper is on public sector wages. It has a focus on the Danish model, as I've learned now that I should stick to. We try to frame it more in terms of the Nordic model, but now I will say the Danish model because that's what we do in each of our countries. The work we did here is based on work that was done in the Danish Wage Structure Committee. And some of you might have heard about this Wage Structure Committee. It was actually the result of a strike in the Danish labor market between the nurses and their employers, which was the regions. And it was a very long strike. It took several months. And at some point, the government intervened because there were so high waiting lists at the hospitals that we could simply not live with it. It was a legal strike, but the government had to interfere anyway because of these long waiting lists. So in the end, the part of the settlement was that there should be a wage structure committee looking at wages in the public sector. So the result of all that work is some of the stuff that we have condensed now into this paper here. But the disclaimer is because the work that we show here is, of course, our view, Mette's and my view, on what is the result of all this. And it might not represent everyone in the Wage Structure Committee because that is views from employer side, employee side, experts, and so on and so forth. So it's just to give you a little disclaimer. If you're interested in seeing all the reports, they are publicly available on this webpage, lønstrukturkomiteen.dk, so you can simply just go there and download all the reports and sub-reports if you're interested. Right. So the questions that we're interested in here in this paper is we want to, of course, understand public sector wages. And we want to understand how they should be determined. That's a big question. And it's not straightforward in any way. So we also want to understand a little bit why this is so hard. What we do in this paper is we do a lot of descriptive work. So we try to describe what the world looks like so that we can get a common ground and so we know what we're discussing, from which standpoint we're discussing. So that's what I will mainly present here. When I talk about wages here, I'm talking about hourly wages. It's a standardized measure. It corresponds to what an employee would see on his or her payslip. So it's the pay you would see on the contract. So it's not adjusted to absence, holidays, so on and so forth. Right? There's another wage measure on that, which is also in the Wage Structure Committee report, but I'm not presenting that here. Right. So public sector, we all know the public sector in the Nordic countries are very generous. They're very large. A lot of people are employed in the public sector. It's 30% of employees in Denmark and Norway and Sweden. I'm not sure exactly what the number is for Finland. I think it's a little bit different. It's way above the OECD average of around 18%. So public sectors are extremely large. And also a lot of women are employed in the public sector. So in Denmark, it's 70% of the employees that are women. And even having all these women in the public sector, we actually do see some gender segregation in the public sector because the women are taking the health jobs, the care jobs, teaching jobs to a large degree. Men are working in military, police, and so on and so forth. So we actually do see a lot of gender segregation in the public sector. Yes. So this graph here that you'll see in the corner actually goes very well with what Lars presented. What you see is private sector wage increases and state wage increases and increases for municipalities and regions in Denmark. And you can see that the wages are more or less on top of each other. And that's this parallelism that we've seen in wages in the Danish case. So if wages deviate a bit, then they're forced more or less to be the same. It doesn't happen overnight, but over time these wages follow each other very well. So we see that in the Danish case. And of course, it's an issue setting wages. Lars also talked a lot about that. We are small open economies. We trade a lot with the world outside. So we have to take that into account when we set wages. And it's difficult in the public sector to price goods. So how do you price care or health or whatever? That's really difficult. So what we do is we price relative to the private sector in the exporting industries. And that's why we see this very parallel wage growth in the Danish case. Right. So when we do that, we see that the economic growth is similar, and we also know that we will then balance the competitiveness in the real wage growth. One of the weaknesses of this setup is that there's a very slow adaptation to shocks to the economy. So when something bad happens or something good happens to the economy, it takes some time before it's actually, you can see it in the wages, right? So there's this lag in the wage to adjust to this, right? So wages are based on collective bargaining. Lars already taught us all about that. In Denmark, it's the case that these collective bargaining set the overall financial framework, so that's the money that the public sector employees can kind of share. It's basically a null-sum game, right? So if some get more, others get relatively less. So usually everyone gets a little bit more, but some get more, and some gets relatively less more. So they set an overall percentage increase in the wages that goes for the public employees, and then some get a little bit more of that, and some a little bit less than that. And then there's also this regulation agreement which ensures this parallelism that we just saw in the previous graph. Right. So wages consist of many different components, and that's actually a challenge when you have to set wages. And I can illustrate it on the next graph. Because what you see here, you might not be able to read all these different occupation groups, but what you see is 50 different occupation groups in the public sector. And you see their hourly wages. And you can see that some groups have high hourly wages, some have, I wouldn't say low, but much lower hourly wages. And you also see that these bars consist of different colors, and that's because the different wage components weigh differently in the different occupation groups. So the dark blue one is the basic earnings. Pension is the red part of it. And then you see that some of the groups also have a light blue component to the wages. And the light blue component, that's the overtime allowance. And for some groups, that's actually a big share of their wages. And that particularly goes for the health workers, care workers, and so on. For people like me, researchers, it's not there because I just get a fixed pay. And then if I work more, it's, that's my fault. Then my hourly wage decrease, you could say, but it will not be recorded up here. Right. So for some groups, some of these components are more important than other. Right. And that's also something that has to be taken into account when wages are shown and when they're negotiated and so on. Right. So maybe I should say that all this conflict in Denmark started with the nurses. The nurses are somewhere up in a little bit above the middle. This is the nurses that we have here. And then up here we have people with very high education. That's, for example, junior doctors, officers, researchers, priests, and so on. And what we have down here are people with fairly low education. If you're, for example, a childcare assistant or a cleaning and household assistant and so on, jobs where you don't really need a formal education, they're typically placed at the bottom, right? So that's what we have seen here. And we can actually see it more clearly if we split by education groups. These, at the top graph is hourly wages based on education group, and the higher we get, or the further we get to the right, then the higher the education group. And we can clearly see that education and wages are positively related, which is not a big surprise. We can also see at the bottom graph that if you have more work experience, then your wages are also higher, exactly as we would expect. At some point, it levels off at around 16 years of work experience. Right. An issue with showing the relation between education and hourly wages is that it's a little bit hard sometimes to measure education accurately, at least in the Danish case, and I guess that also goes for the other Nordic countries, because some types of education are not what we would call formal education, and that's not in the registers. So we rely on the registers when we show graphs like this. But for example, for the police officers, they have a lot of informal education at the police academy, which is not going to be reported here. And therefore, their wages are actually artificially high. So one of the groups will be artificially high with the wages simply because some of the education is not recorded exactly as it perhaps should be. So that's also one of the things we might have to consider, how to accurately measure these things. Right. So to go back to the first slide, we want to understand what determines wages. And one way of doing it, at least as an economist, is to set up a statistical model. We like that. So what we did in the Wage Structures Committee was to set up a very simple statistical model where we simply related the actual hourly wage rate to 3 components. And that's the level of education, the years of work experience, and then whether the individual had management tasks. All these 3 components are clearly positively related to wages. So it makes sense to put these in as separate components. Then there might be a lot of other things that also explains wages, right? We just included them as a whole because they might affect different occupation groups in different ways, so we cannot just say that they all affect in a positive way or a negative way. So what we did was we explored these different components separately in some of the sub-analysis. Right. But what we showed is that when you just include these three components, education, work experience, and whether you have management tasks, you can actually explain about 50% of the variation in wages just by adding these three components. So they are extremely important. Now, if we want to see who deviates, where does it deviate, the wages that are predicted by this very, very simple statistical model and then the actual wages that people have, we can look at this graph here. Again, I know you cannot see the actual occupation groups, but the main point is that for some of the groups, and that is the groups that we have here in the middle, the model fairly accurately predicts the actual wage that people have. Actually, we have the nurses also in here. We have researchers as well in here, and other groups. Right. We also see that some groups have negative deviation, and that means that the model predicts a higher wage than their actual wage rate. That goes often for the low educated groups. And it's not really that surprising because the model takes into account the formal level of education. And some of the people working as, for example, childcare assistants, they have had a formal education, but that's not rewarded when they're working as a childcare assistant if it's an education in something completely different. So for some of these jobs that do not really require a lot of education, you might work there, you might have taken a formal education elsewhere, but it's not really rewarded, but you might be rewarded based on the actual tasks you're solving. So it's not surprising that we see these negative deviations for these groups. On the other hand, we also see some very positive deviations here at the bottom, and that's, for example, for junior doctors, engineers, IT employees. So the model predicts, in this case, a lower wage than their actual wages. And that could be related to the task they're performing. Maybe they have a lot of responsibility, or it's a very difficult task. They might be rewarded in ways that this very, very simple model cannot handle. Right, so that's what you see here. So the model is just, it's not giving us a fair wage in any way. It's just trying to structure in a way how education, work experience, and management tasks can explain the actual wages people have. Right. Okay, so we also want to compare to the private sector. So I'm going to do that only in one slide here. What you see here is the public sector as the blue, and the private sector is red here. And we can see that the public sector wage is very compressed, at least compared to the private sector. Right. So we're not surprised about that, I hope, that wages are more compressed in the public sector than in the private sector. But what you might be a bit surprised about is that the median wages, that's this solid line here, they're almost the same across public and private sectors. The average wages are not the same, but they're not that far off. It's about 20 Danish crowns. But as you probably would also expect, the average wages in the private sector is a little bit higher than the average wages in the public sector. And that again goes with the distribution. There are a lot more people in the private sector having high wages, but also more people in the private sector having the very, very low wages. So it goes with these distributions. There are lots of problems with comparing across sectors. I'm not going to go into detail with that, but there's a lot about that in the report. So the model is, I would say, pretty good in many ways. There are lots of strength. We have these small open economies. We have to consider that there's a lot of competition from abroad. And we also have to consider that the public and private sector is competing for labor, right? So if one is employed in the public sector, you cannot, at least often, not be employed in the private sector at the same time. So, you know, if wages are too high in the public sector, wages in the private sector will also tend to go up. And that's really a problem for competition. Right, so it makes sense that the real wage growth in the public sector follows the wage growth in the private sector, and especially when it's based on the exporting part of the private sector. Right, and when that's in place, then we have the financial stability. We see that we are internationally competitive, and we also see that we have an overall high employment rate. Right, and at least that's what we see in the Danish case. Challenges are also part of these models. You already talked about some of them, Lars, and I have some extra ones that I can add to the story. So one of the issues that we noted when looking at the different occupation groups is that given the fact that the different occupation groups more or less have the same wage growth, that's an issue, especially when there are recruitment problems. Because if you want to give some more, then others have to get less, otherwise the null-sum gain dies. Right, so that's something we have to deal with in these models. And we have to think about how to do that. And we also see that there's a very slow response to, for example, excess demand of labor. So for nurses, for example, there's been recruitment issues, which was also part of this conflict. And if you want to do something about that, then you need to either raise wages, which you cannot just do immediately, or you need to somehow deal with recruitment, that is having more people being educated as nurses, or so on and so forth. These are not things you can solve very quickly, and that's an issue also for this model. There's also some built-in rigidity in the model, and it turns out that if you look at the different occupation groups, there are actually certain groups that tend to always have fairly low, relatively low wages compared to other occupation groups. And these groups are often dominated by women. And now the question is, why is that? And that there are many reasons for that. Some of it is related to what has been prioritized in the different negotiations, in the collective bargaining, but there might also be other reasons for it. We tried to look a little bit about, if you have problems recruiting, that's what this graph here shows. This is when you cannot fill in vacant slots that you have. Then we tried to see, is that related to these deviations in wages we saw before? And when you look at this graph, you can see there's absolutely no pattern. Right? It's all over the place. And that also means that it's not that those that have recruitment issues, that they would then have the higher deviations in wages. That's definitely not what we see. So there are some issues with this model in terms of trying to fit recruitment needs. Right. So, yes. So to summarize this, there's some clear strengths of the model, but there are also some weaknesses, in particular in terms of the adaptation and responsiveness to economic shocks or to recruitment issues in the public sector. Right. So to conclude, and maybe look a little bit at policy implications, that's maybe a strong word here, but we know that the wage setting across the Nordic countries is quite similar, at least for Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Finland is a special case, I would say. So there's definitely great opportunity to learn from each other, and I think we should really take advantage of that, because some countries are very good at dealing with some sorts of problems, and then we could perhaps learn in the other countries. We can see that the model works very well and ensures stability in many cases. It definitely ensures that we're competitive, which is really important. But the model could also be further developed, especially to take into account some of the issues we've had with recruitment and so on. So the suggestions from the Wage Structure Committee was that the model should be somehow made more flexible. Again, that's not super easy. One way of dealing with issues is to use tripartite negotiations, which have been used a lot in Denmark, and which were also following this Wage Structure Committee, which Lars mentioned in the end. But that's only a short-term solution, right? That doesn't solve any problems in the longer run. Typically does not. So we need to find a way to not just come with these short-run fixes. We need to find a way to make it more stable in the longer run. And maybe one of the reasons, or one of the solutions, is that wage growth does not necessarily has to be the same in all occupations. If we can kind of get away from that setting, then maybe some things would be easier. But there are different principles that we suggest that is used, and I think the key is that it's transparent, so everyone knows what's going on, that it's legitimate and proportional, so that people are rewarded for the qualifications they have, that the model can be flexible and adapt to situations in the labor market, especially when we have shocks to the economy, and then that the model supports the task that has to be solved in the public sector. And that could be by rewarding certain skills, or people working in certain jobs, or taking the bad shifts in the night shifts and the weekend shifts, which needs to be filled. If it becomes easier to give or to reward these type of tasks, then maybe it would also be easier to solve some of the issues we have. Right. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.